The importance behind studying history is the fact that history is cyclical. It repeats. Therefore, by studying our past, we are able to learn from our mistakes and better prepare for our future. This idea resonates among the similarities between the Black Death and the COVID-19 pandemic. John Hatcher's The Black Death tells the story of the catastrophic spread of the plague in the 14th century town of Walsham. The story is told through the eyes of Master John, a parish priest in Walsham, as he guides his community through the pestilence, while thematically questioning what the meaning behind the plague is and why God would allow such a terrible thing to happen. Throughout this presentation, I'll be retelling John Hatcher's The Black Death, but pay attention, as the 14th century docudrama closely aligns with the events we have been experiencing over the past 16 months. In 1346, the town of Walsham experienced a series of bad omens. Food shortages, death, poverty, and lack of effective treatments for illnesses plagued the city. In the words of character William Woodbite, every man thinks he will live long and does not believe he will die soon. His words remain true, as these unfortunate events caused little deep concern among the people of Walsham. In the winter of 1347 and 1348, Master John visited his friend Richard, the keeper of the infirmary at Bury St. Edmund's Abbey. Richard informed him that nothing, it seems, can halt its progress. We can only pray that God's infinite mercy will cause him to stay his hand before it reaches our shores. Master John was in disbelief at Richard's stories, and he didn't want to instill fear in his parishioners who were already suffering. However, word got out and the parishioners quickly turned to worship. Many parishioners left to go on pilgrimages. However, Master John decided that neither he nor any of his assistant clergy could be spared from their duties in the parish. While others ventured out, Master John and his clergy stayed in Walsham. Lines piled up at shops along the way. Pilgrims bought precious mementos and sacred objects while they were still available, as vendors warned that supplies were running dangerously short. Sir Robert informed many of the pilgrims that few residents of the holy city were sick and fewer were dying, but the plague moved on with renewed ferocity, leaving thousands and thousands dead in its wake. Pilgrims continued to hear stories, one being from a sea captain stating that the sick are often treated like dogs by their families, who put food and drink next to their bed and then flee the house, leaving the poor creatures to die alone, uncared for, and unconfessed. In the summer of 1348, they all faced an awful and imminent threat that would soon be among them. Master John told his parishioners that he had no final answers, and that the wisest and most pious men in the church were seeking to explain why God had called down this scourge. The people of Walsham took measures to try and get rid of the plague, including hours of prayer, hours of fasting, and mortifying their flesh as a method of penance. Maybe God would forgive them, and maybe the plague would end. Fresh news of death and sickness in Walsham, as well as neighboring villages, further caused panic. Fewer friends and neighbors showed up to comfort each other, as funeral processions and burials were less well attended. The general agreement of the community? It was common sense: distance from the sick and the dead. And in the fall and winter of 1348, a message from Prince and Lord Edward concluded with, "What the King and the Bishop of London feared is now a reality." In the new year of 1349, Master John went to visit Richard, who had done studies on how to remedy the plague. However, he had no success. The two wondered how and why the plague spread so fast, and Richard thought that the plague was caused by evil spirits, and by making eye contact with the sick, one could die. Master John used this knowledge, stating, "This must be how people have become infected, even though they have scrupulously avoided any intimate contact with the sick." With his new learned knowledge from Richard, Master John returned to Walsham with new ways of prevention, giving the people a sense of hope. However, death and sickness continued to rise. Overall, travelers were hasty in their departures. They were stopped in and out of Walsham, and if people did travel, they avoided typical tracks and means of travel so that they would not get caught. The thing of most importance to the people of Walsham was the sacrament of last rites, which was performed dangerously close to a person's last breath. However, the last rites could not be ministered normally, as patients were too sick and unresponsive when the time came for the sacrament. Though there was no shortage of clergy in Walsham, they made excuses not to see the patients for last rites, as they did not want to become sick themselves. Master John, however, remained loyal and was always there for his patients. Upon each new death, he continued to search for the reason why God would let such a thing occur. In the spring of 1349, Sir Edmund de Wells, through John Talbot, delivered a message to the town of Walsham, including information on death, elections, and the plague itself, receiving various reactions from the villagers and further throwing the town into turmoil. And though it seemed that things were becoming safer, death and illness continued to strike Walsham. In mid-July of 1349, the deaths began to cease and the people made their way out of darkness. The people of Walsham began to experience a loosening of constraints. However, many were unprepared to take on the looming world of disorder. Despite their new sense of freedom, the people of Walsham had to rebuild and relearn how to live life without family and friends that were lost during the plague. The people now lived in a world of poverty and disorder, where both the poor and the rich were suffering. Everything they had worked for before the plague was destroyed, and the people of Walsham would have to work harder than ever to restore their lives.